with that all done, hi, I'm Tony Bird. Welcome to the webinar. So a little about me. I'm a senior asbestos consultant here at Chem Safety. I've been with the team for over 7 years and predominantly working with asbestos. In that time, we've seen a lot of asbestos contamination on some large and small sites. So hopefully we can help you avoid some of the pitfalls involved with asbestos contamination. So as we all know, or probably know, asbestos was a fairly common ingredient in many building products in the home and workplace, predominantly from the 1940s through to the late 1990s in New Zealand. The WorkSafe cutoff point for building materials is the year 2000. So if undisturbed, the majority of asbestos containing materials don't pose a significant health risk. It's only when asbestos fibres become airborne that a hazard is created. So hopefully in a workplace situation, there's an asbestos management plan in place to identify asbestos containing materials as per the Health and Safety Act from 2016. Additionally, a renovation survey or a demolition survey should have been undertaken prior to undertaking any works. So in a normal domestic situation where no work's been carried out, it's unlikely that all the asbestos containing materials will have been identified prior to there being some sort of contamination event. So the most common asbestos contamination we see is water damage to stippled or textured plaster ceilings. And sometimes that damage is just by people walking around in the ceiling and then falling through. So it should be noted that here in Christchurch anyway, after the earthquake, some of the repairs involved overlaying older textured plaster ceilings with new chipboard. So what that means in practical terms is that you might not know you've even got a textured plaster ceiling until parts of it are on the floor. So it's something to be aware of. We commonly also see paper-backed vinyl exposed during renovations. So it's either by a professional flooring contractor or by the homeowner themselves. I should note at this point that it's far cheaper to drop off a sample of vinyl to an accredited laboratory or have someone come out and sample the flooring than it is to decontaminate an area. So that's something to think about. So most laboratories will have a 24-hour turnaround on samples if they're urgently required. And you should note that paper backing is a friable Class A material and it can contain 80 to 100% asbestos. So some pretty significant contamination can be the result of that, and decontamination can involve removal of all of the soft furnishings, which would include carpets, curtains, furniture. It's not ideal. So ideally, a flooring contractor should be able to identify suspected asbestos materials and have them sampled prior to undertaking any works. And suspected asbestos containing flooring materials would include any vinyl products manufactured before the year 2000 and their associated underlay material. So unfortunately, it's not always the case. And like I said, we've seen some pretty significant contamination. We've got a wee case study to show you later about that. So the other thing we see is ceiling voids and underfloor voids. So asbestos contamination there is typically identified during a refurbishment or renovations. And these materials can include things like former asbestos roofing products and pipe lagging. We see that in ceiling voids fairly commonly, mostly in industrial, but sometimes commercial, sometimes domestic situations. So we also see overlaid cement board wall linings, things like that. Then they're typically, when people take wall linings off, they find these, and they're normally in bathrooms, toilets, and laundries in older houses. Sometimes in the underfloor situation, we can also find cement board debris left over from the construction and bits of older vinyl cutoffs. So it's important to note here again that contractors undertaking refurbishment or renovations on a domestic property have a legal requirement to have an asbestos refurbishment carried out prior to undertaking the works. So in a domestic renovation situation, the main contractor becomes the PCBU, not the homeowner, and so may be liable for fines or decontamination costs. What should you do if you suspect some asbestos contamination. The first thing I'd suggest is to restrict some access. So that's important for a number of reasons. So first is to reduce the risk of anyone becoming exposed to asbestos. Second is reduce the possibility of materials being tracked from one area to another, sort of spreading the contamination. And also by closing doors and reducing access, the air movement is reduced, and that can, less airborne asbestos to other areas of the building is a good thing. So the second step would be to confirm that the material is asbestos, because not all textured plaster or cement board or materials contain asbestos. So ideally, get someone out to have a look, but most laboratories or assessors will be quite happy to answer a phone call regarding materials. So just bring them up, ask them what they think, whether it will require sampling or not. They might want a photograph with some more details. If that's the case, you can sample the material yourself and drop it off to an accredited laboratory. You're going to need to be wearing a P2N95 mask as a minimum PPE for that. Alternatively, you could get an assessor out to sample the material for you. They should be able to let you know almost immediately if the material is asbestos, whether or not it's going to constitute a contamination event. That's quite important. It should be noted that confirmation of material containing asbestos doesn't just involve burning it with a cigarette lighter or tasting it or trying to draw something with it. That does happen. You need it to get analysed properly. So if the material is confirmed to contain asbestos, it's probably a good idea at this point to contact your insurance provider, just because it might get interesting later. So at this stage, if it is asbestos and it does look like there's been a contamination event, you need to get an assessor to conduct a contamination assessment. A list of assessors is available on the WorkSafe website. And if you had an assessor take the original sample, then they're likely the best person to come back, just because they're already familiar with the situation and the material. So if they've come and you've gotten results from the contamination assessment, if required, at that point, you'll need to get a removalist in to decontaminate or remove the area. After that's been carried out, for a Class A or a Class B removal, you'll need to get a clearance certificate, and that again is done by an assessor who's independent of the removal company. And ideally, that's going to be the assessor who carried out the contamination assessment. And that clearance certificate will show you that the building is safe to reoccupy at this point. So the next one is the what not to do. Try not to leave doors open to the area. Tracking material through the building isn't going to improve the situation. Try not to disturb the material anymore. So squaring up holes in a damaged ceiling with a jigsaw or something, it's not going to help you out much there either. So absolutely don't use a domestic vacuum cleaner. They will make the fibers airborne. It's really bad at that point. The fibers quite floaty, go everywhere, and there's no cost-effective way of decontaminating a vacuum cleaner. So essentially it'll need to be thrown out as asbestos waste. Similarly, brushes, brooms, shovels, all those sorts of things, probably not a good idea, because they are just going to spread that asbestos contamination around. So effectively, asbestos decontamination and removal is better off left to the professionals, as they've got the knowledge and equipment to conduct the work safely. And at the end of the day, you should get a clearance certificate saying that it's safe to reoccupy. So what should you expect from an asbestos contamination assessment? So a good contamination assessment will confirm that the material doesn't actually contain asbestos. And they make the removal process so much easier for the removalist, because they show extent and what might be required. It should show air and swab sample results, hopefully on a site plan somewhere, so you can see the limits of the asbestos contamination. There should be photographs of the site showing where the samples were taken and any observations. There should be comparison with the results of the relevant standards, some information regarding the health effects of exposure to asbestos, and a discussion about the extent of the contamination, and information and advice about the decontamination that's required. So we went to a job a couple of years ago, and I thought I'd briefly go over it. So we went to a house after we were contacted by a building contractor, and he was concerned that a subcontractor had exposed some asbestos-containing paper backing. We got to site and we were met with the pictures you see in front of you here. Yeah, so partial vinyl removal. Walking through the lounge, and we noted that there's a roll of the partially removed vinyl propped up in the corner. That's asbestos-containing paper-backed vinyl in the corner of the lounge, and the vacuum cleaner you see there, if the red arrow is the vacuum cleaner that was used to clean up after he discovered that he'd put paper backing everywhere. Yeah, less than ideal. Yeah, that's a real bird in the background. So this is an adapted results table from the air testing we actually did at that site, and you can see here that the red highlighted ones there are well above the WES. So these are places where an asbestos removalist shouldn't be exposed to this much, let alone a homeowner or a family who are living in the place at the time. So we made some recommendations. This is a shortened version of the recommendations, but the occupier of the home had to leave. Obviously, the asbestos fibres were quite bad. The removal of the paper backing in the bathroom and toilet was still required, and a clearance needed to be obtained for that. The removal of the carpets, curtains, bedding, and furniture had to be undertaken. There was loose, fine asbestos fibres throughout the house. The vacuum cleaner had to be disposed of as waste, and at the point when all of this was completed, a clearance certificate had to be issued, including air monitoring and surface testing. So it was quite a drawn-out process, and I suspect the homeowner was out of the house for some months. Fairly expensive, and I suspect the worst part about that is the family was unwittingly exposed to some quite high levels of viable asbestos fibres. So I thought I'd talk just very briefly about soil contamination. It often comes up. It's slightly outside our remit, but soil contamination should be undertaken. Soil contamination assessments should be undertaken by a suitably qualified and experienced practitioner. The short word for that is SQEP. And they'll follow the Building and Research Association of New Zealand guidelines. That's the BRANZ guidelines for assessing and managing asbestos in soil. A list of all the qualified SQEPs is available on the council website. But in general, if you find a piece of cement board sticking out of the ground and you think there's a lot more, it's probably worthwhile to get that single sample just tested prior to contacting a SQEP in case it's not asbestos. This is one of those situations where it's definitely a good idea not to shift any more soil or to get a digger in or do anything else until a professional has appraised the situation. So a SQEP will likely conduct soil sampling, and that's going to include something like a preliminary site investigation, followed by a detailed site investigation. If they find lots of things, then the implementation of a remedial action plan. So depending on the nature and extent of contamination, removal of soil may trigger the Resource Management Act, and so resource consent might be required, dependent on the results of that. But that's for a SQEP to decide. So thanks very much.